I woke up to the sound of my dogs in an absolute panic. Not normal barking, but the kind of frantic, desperate sound that tells you your dog knows that there's a threat nearby. If you've ever had a dog, you know the difference. I jumped out of bed and started moving towards the stairs. I told my wife to stay where she was and that I would tell her once I knew what was happening. As I crept down in the dark, I looked out the window and saw a man hiding in the bushes at the edge of my yard. He was dressed in black tactical gear, rifle at the low ready, and looking towards my house. He was carrying an AR-15 equipped with a suppressor, a serious kit, especially in New York, where these rifles have been outlawed and where suppressors are nearly impossible to legally own. The man in the shadows raised his rifle, pointing it at my face. I dropped down to the stairs to get out of line of sight and scrambled back upstairs, dragging my dogs with me, terrified that they were about to get shot. I pulled up my security camera feed on my phone and realized that my house was surrounded. Just days earlier, Rolling Stone had published a profile of me with the headline, "The Neo-Nazi Hunter Next Door." The story went absolutely viral. It was everywhere, including in all of the Telegram chats that I had been infiltrating for years inside of white supremacist networks. To say that they were furious would be a real understatement. The piece described how Task Force Butler Institute had released a report identifying specific members of Patriot Front who were tied to specific crimes in Idaho, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. These were hate crimes. That report was being used to build civil cases as Patriot Front was getting dragged into court around the country, and they were facing criminal charges too. I threw my dogs into the bedroom and closed the door behind them, shouting to my wife, "Stay upstairs. We're being swatted." This was what we had expected. It was only a matter of time. The Aryan Freedom Network had just published a screenshot of my New York voter registration, including my home address, across extremist channels everywhere. "Say hello to your family," wrote Tanya Suberry using an anti-Jewish slur as she shared a family Christmas photo of my family, which included 2 toddlers. Tanya Suberry uses the online moniker Daisy Barr, which is the name of one of the KKK's first women leaders. She was furious at me after I publicly revealed that she had personally vetted me and invited me to join her at the Aryan Freedom Network's White Unity Conference in Texas, and because I showed up. In chats linked to the international terrorist organization Atomwaffen, a user going by the handle Cobra401k asked for my phone number and address. An admin for the group replied and directed him to the docs shared by Daisy Barr in one of Atomwaffen's channels. That admin was Brandon Clint Russell, a former Florida National Guardsman and co-founder of Atomwaffen, who days after sharing my address would be arrested for planning a terrorist attack against the electrical grid. Cobra 401k, who asked for my phone number and address, was Kyle Paul Reynolds. Reynolds would later be indicted in federal court on weapons charges, unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition by a convicted felon. He had previously been sentenced for 5 years for beating a senior citizen. What drew the police to the house that night was a caller claiming to be me, saying that I had already murdered my wife and I was armed inside my house, waiting for police to try to stop the bloodshed. That's what a death by cop swatting attempt looks like. Police responded as if they were walking into a potential standoff with a madman. Weapons drawn, split-second decisions. My family inside. I noticed my phone had 2 missed calls from a number that I had saved, a local detective. Thankfully, years prior to this event, I introduced myself to the department and let them know who I am, what I do for work, and that getting swatted was virtually inevitable. I live in a small town, so thankfully they took the time and took this warning seriously. That preventative action may be why my door wasn't breached, and it may be why I'm alive today. I called back and verified with the detective that this was the situation that we talked about and anticipated. He gave the order to stand down from their most aggressive posture, but told me that they still had to complete the welfare check. I would have to go outside on this freezing night with my hands up, lift my shirt up to show that I wasn't armed, and talk with police because they needed to complete that welfare check. The police I met on my porch that night were filled with even more adrenaline than I was. One officer kept repeating himself as I explained the concept of swatting to him. He had never heard of it. I could tell that they were all deeply shaken. Something like this happening in our town, at the time, it was unheard of. But that was only the beginning. 7 months later, in September 2023, my home was targeted again. This time in connection with a Telegram channel calling itself Appalachian Archives. That channel had already doxed me, taking the information that the Aryan Freedom Network had and spreading it even further. The user behind the account had declared that the account's mission was to make reporting on extremism dangerous. And after the second swatting attempt, it posted audio of the call that was made to the police online, like it was a trophy. This wasn't random harassment. Christopher Goldsmith was only the beginning, they wrote in a threat to other researchers and journalists. Appalachian Archives quickly escalated from doxing journalists and encouraging harassment campaigns to posting direct threats against them, and even showing up at a reporter's home with an allied neo-Nazi gang, the Tennessee Active Club, so that they could take a series of propaganda photos. They stood outside Jordan Green's house. He's a reporter for Raw Story. And they were burning road flares with a sign that said, "Freedom of the press is not freedom from consequence." A clear threat. Police sat there and observed without interfering. Then, Appalachian Archives and the Tennessee Active Club started posting photos with Gabrielle Hansen, a mayoral candidate in Franklin, Tennessee. Not to intimidate her, but because they were interviewing her, endorsing her, and acting as security at her campaign events. It wasn't until August 2024 that the person, or one of the people behind the Appalachian Archives account, was hit with federal charges. One day after Kai Liam Nix was publicly identified in The New Yorker in an article titled "Infiltrating the Far Right," with help from researcher Jeff Chischauer at the SPLC, the DOJ finally announced some charges. The person behind that channel, Kai Liam Nix, was a member of Patriot Front. He was charged with firearms trafficking and lying on a federal security clearance form. He wasn't just some anonymous troll in a basement. He was an active duty soldier with the 82nd Airborne out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and he had a secret security clearance. A man threatening journalists, posting recordings of swatting calls, and working with a neo-Nazi crew to support a MAGA Republican mayoral candidate in Tennessee was being paid by and trained to fight with American tax dollars. He pled guilty in September 2025, and his sentencing has been continued, extending the timeline of accountability. It's a case that seems to keep facing unusual delays, and my suspicion is that it's because he's become a cooperating witness for the government against Patriot Front. Brandon Clint Russell was found guilty on charges of terrorism and will be behind bars for a long while. Kyle Paul Reynolds is out on $10,000 bail, living in Rhode Island, and a federal court has granted him permission to travel to Massachusetts for work and medical appointments. Tanya Suberry told journalists last year that she's continuing to grow her organization, the Aryan Freedom Network. None to this day has been charged for any doxing, swatting, or threats against me or any other journalist. The federal government rarely prosecutes these crimes, even though they can be deadly. Extremism doesn't just live online. It doesn't just stay in chat rooms. It lives in human beings who are working to harass, intimidate, and cause violence against truth tellers. Their point is deterrence. If you can make reporting dangerous the way that Kai Liam Nix tried to, you can slow it down. If you can make investigators fear for their family's safety, maybe they'll quit. If you can make local journalists feel isolated, you can operate in the dark. but that only works if no one connects the dots. That's where local investigative journalism and the anti-fascist researchers who provide tips to journalists become a firewall for our democracy. Today's guest is Phil Williams of News Channel 5 Nashville, one of the most relentless investigative reporters in the country. Phil has tracked extremist networks, exposed corruption, and followed the money and the lies when others were content to look the other way. He was targeted by Appalachian Archives, Kai Liam Nix, who attempted to blackmail him into adjusting his reporting. But Phil, he never backed down. In this episode, we're going to talk about how these intimidation ecosystems actually function and what we can do about it. How does a local journalist or anyone working with their identity known to the public work to expose extremism in their hometown without getting killed? Why does federal accountability move so slow? And why does local journalism so often move first? This isn't a story about what happened to me. It's about how escalation works. It's about how extremism tests the boundaries of our institutions. And it's about why journalism, real journalism, is one of the last lines of defense that we still have. Because democracy is worth going on offense for. Now let's get into it. Phil Williams, thank you so much for joining us at On Offense. You are a local journalist who has made national news for covering elements of the extremists on the far right, neo-Nazis, QAnon, and you have paid a personal price for that, which has put you in a strange position as a journalist starting to become part of the story, not because that's what you were seeking out, but because the subjects of newsworthy action decided to react and retaliate against you. So you've recently started a Substack, speaking a little bit more in your own voice and kind of talking about the evolution of your understanding of the problem of extremism in this country. Why is it that you have broken out to start this newsletter and gone beyond the television focused journalism that you come from?
Well, and thanks for having me on. I think it was really important for me as I've been on this journey now, and I call it a journey because there are all sorts of twists and turns when you get into this world of investigating extremism. I started on this journey more than 2 years ago now. And I had done a few stories prior to that about hate groups, but this was the first time I fully immersed myself into this subject. And so there was a huge learning curve to find, where did these groups hang out online? What motivates these groups? How are these groups interconnected? And so that's, played into my reporting for my local station, News Channel 5 in Nashville. But I gained just a huge understanding of what's going on nationally. What's at stake nationally, that, what wasn't exactly appropriate for a local audience, but, hatecomes-to-mainstreet.com, I hopefully will give me a chance to kind of examine the big picture from more of a national perspective. And like you, I think there is a tremendous amount at stake. I think most people, including myself, did not know how interconnected these networks are across the country. I don't think I fully appreciated exactly what was going on across the country. So Hate Comes to Main Street hopefully will be my vehicle for exploring the larger issues and looking at, who are the players and what's at stake.
So now that you've seen it, I know you can't look away, and you see the problem of extremism everywhere. You understand how it's interconnected, how these locally active groups, be it an active club or a chapter within Patriot Front or any of the other extremist organizations. How is it that you think other local reporters are going to have their aha moment that you did? Do you think that there are going to be more local news stations that suddenly have experts in extremism, or do you think that what you've experienced and been public about, the retaliation, the harassment campaigns, do you think that folks are going to be too afraid to learn more about this?
Well, I'm not optimistic because, number one, all media right now are just under tremendous economic pressures. Our business is struggling, and there is a movement, with television stations, for example, for more consolidation. So, which will ultimately mean, fewer reporters. Hopefully, it will mean, some strong news organizations like mine that are still standing. But there are economic pressures. It is very rare. I have just a tremendous gig with News Channel 5 in Nashville because they support this sort of in-depth reporting. They support my having this strong focus on this one area, but that's not the norm. And so that's part of why I've started this Substack publication. Is I think it's rare. I think it's going to be rare to have this sort of focus, and that's where I think I can make a difference in the current media landscape.
So you stumbled into extremism, as far as I understand it from your writings.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it was because you were following a local mayoral race. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was a mayoral race in Franklin, Tennessee, which is a very affluent community just south of Nashville. We had a MAGA candidate for mayor that, someone contacted me and said, I think you need to check her out. She seems to have some skeletons in her closet. One of the skeletons in her closet was she had previously been convicted for promoting prostitution when she was in Texas. And so I started investigating her. It was just one strange story after another. She was posting social media photos of a group of women that she said were supporters. I was able to identify the women. They had no idea what she was. They had no idea she was running for mayor. Most of them did not even know her. She claimed or she was against pride festivals in the city of Franklin, yet I found photos where her husband had appeared in nothing but a Speedo at a pride festival in Chicago while he was running for Congress, and he did so at her encouragement. She claimed to have premonitions about a school shooting and had claimed to have told local police about that. I got the body cam video. It was pure bunk. And so I was covering all of these various scandals, and I showed up at a candidates forum. It was one of those situations where I thought, okay, I'm just going to go cover it, see if anything happens. And I walk in, and there are these white supremacists staking out the front entrance, the back entrance, the inside hallways. Someone said you were here making a statement, and I don't know what that statement is.
No, we're not making a statement. We're here for Gabrielle Hanson's statement.
You are?
Yeah.
We're just making sure everything goes well.
Okay, and are you concerned about things not going well?
It's a possibility, and we're just here to protect Gabrielle.
And one of them I actually recognized because he had actually threatened to kill me about 20 years before. Ironically, it was a very cordial meeting, and so when these were people associated with the Tennessee Active Club, and so that was really an eye-opening moment for me, that white supremacist neo-Nazis would feel so emboldened to show up at a candidates forum in an affluent red community. And that's when I realized it's like, okay, something is going on. Something's in the water, something's in the political culture that they think it's okay for them to show up and provide security.
Now, we've seen these extremist groups, like Proud Boys, I think, are the ones who've received the most coverage, showing up at local like school board events and that type of thing. How is it that you recognized these members of the Tennessee Active Club as neo-Nazis?
Well, it came a few months after Jeff Tischhauser with the Southern Poverty Law Center had published a report about the Tennessee Active Club having a fight club on the second floor of a convenience store. And so it was, there's a good case of me standing on the shoulders of, researchers who were, heavily invested in this area. I remembered that reporting by Jeff. And in fact, when you see the video, you'll see me stumbling with, I remember your group, it's the Tennessee something, and then they volunteer active club. So they were very out front, very proud of their presence, and so that's a case where I had at least read the research and knew what to look for.
So, were these members of the Tennessee Active Club going there masked, or were they going under their true identities, face showing and everything?
There was only one person who was masked, and I would later find out it was a 17-year-old, and so he was wearing a mask, although after my first report came out, he sent me a photo of him unmasked with showing his swastika tattoo on his chest.
Wow, that's... The brazenness of these folks.
They were not ashamed. They were not trying to hide anything. They wanted it to be known that they were there.
Now, the mayoral candidate, did she know who these people were? Was she embracing their beliefs and their support?
Yeah, that was a really strange part of the story because she initially denied any knowledge and claimed, tried to distance herself from it. But then after my story, she put out a statement that included screenshots from some of the neo-Nazis' Telegram posts. And part of the statement that she put out was a post that said there is no political solution, which is, as you know, is just classic signaling of, political violence is a possibility. And so that was strange that while trying to distance herself from them, that she would put that out. And then later, one of the leaders of the group actually went onto a podcast and said, no, she's not being truthful. She asked us to be there. And then as the story continued, she specifically refused to denounce them.
Are you able to extrapolate this problem at all? Can you imagine or tell us what your sense is of how frequent this type of situation is, where candidates for important offices are directly aligning themselves with extremists and doing so knowingly?
Yeah, I think this particular situation is rare. What I have seen and what you have seen, I'm sure, is that there is a real push within these groups to try to get some of their members to run for office, maybe not fully revealing themselves, but to get more involved in the political sphere. So I think that's more of a concern than this exact situation that we saw in Franklin.
So how did the community in Franklin respond to your reporting?
Well, that's a mixed bag. Number one, there was unprecedented voter turnout. It became a really, really big story, and so people came out. They voted her down 4-1. That obviously is a victory. But for the neo-Nazis who were involved, they also saw this as a victory, because what they saw is you had a very controversial candidate with white supremacist ties, neo-Nazi ties, and 1 out of every 5 voters said, we're okay with her as our mayor. And so that's the flip side. That's the kind of the red flag, the canary in the coal mine, that 1 out of every 5 voters was okay with her as their candidate for mayor.
Yeah, I mean, I see that as an extension of Trumpism, of all of the things that the racist things that Donald Trump has said that are very clearly like textbook racism, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and slurs that he has shared publicly, from a podium while speaking as a presidential candidate. And 77 million Americans signed up for that. They said that was fine, that was okay with them. Do you give any of the 20% who voted for this mayoral candidate, do you give them any benefit of the doubt? Do you think every one of them voted for them, or the majority of them voted for them as an explicit endorsement of these neo-Nazi ties?
I think it would be unfair to say that it was an endorsement of the neo-Nazi ties. I think what is probably a more accurate picture is that our politics have become so tribal. And because she was a MAGA candidate, there was a certain percentage of the population that said, we'll just go with her wherever she goes, because she's one of us, and she's standing up to the media. And so that probably accounts for a significant percentage of her voters. I mean, we had a situation where my photojournalist partner, Brian Staples, and I showed up at a candidate forum, and some of her supporters physically tried to block us from entering, using their bodies to block us. And one woman twice slapped my smartphone out of my hand.
Oh my God, get your camera out of my face.
Stop touching him or you're going to jail. Do you understand? You understand. Keep your hands to yourself. You're a grown-up.
And so I think that it was for them, it became an us versus them situation.
Mm-hmm. And you write about that experience of the woman slapping your phone out of your hand, and the police having to be there to remind her she is a grown adult and she should not be committing assault.
Right.
That is textbook political violence. Do you think that other people in the room with you, other witnesses, understood it that way? Or do you think that in their minds they don't recognize political violence when it's happening right in front of their face?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to the tribal aspect of this, because we published a story online that referenced chaos breaking out at this forum. And there were multiple people who responded saying, I was there was no chaos, again, because their side wasn't being threatened. I think it's another example of how people view J6. If your side was the side involved in storming the Capitol, you don't think it's a big deal. So in this situation, some of her supporters attacking me and my photojournalist partner, that was no big deal to them.
So some of the responses to your reporting on this, to the things that you weren't just reporting on. You were experiencing political violence in person. It triggered a retribution campaign. The Tennessee Active Club is affiliated with Patriot Front. Those are the red, white, and blue neo-Nazis who jump out of U-Hauls every few months.
Why you gotta cover up your face? 3 U-Haul trucks carried about 100 people in the cargo holds. They then marched along Main Street in the crossroads and also marched around the World War I memorial. Testing. The group's leader, Thomas Ryan Rousseau, has posted online many times about box trucks being used for the group.
Can you tell us about how elements of Patriot Front came after you for your reporting?
Yeah, there was an extended harassment campaign. It really started with the local members of the Tennessee Active Club. That night at the candidate forum, before I'd had a chance to do a single story, they posted a photo of me at the forum, claimed I was hanging out with Antifa journalists. I'm not sure what that means, and said that I did not realize that the day of the rope is real. Obviously, reference to the Turner Diaries and the day when journalists and other race traitors would face hanging. And so that was the first signal to me that, okay, this could get intense. From there, it was just one crazy development after another. They created a photo of me in blackface, implying that I had posed in blackface. That there was a story that was circulated by a local Moms for Liberty person that claimed I had once, in response to death threats, paid a black janitor a few dollars a day to go and start my car just in case it blew up, so it would blow up with him and not me, which was just complete falsehood. It was just one thing after another, and then there was a group that got involved called Appalachian Archives. They posted a series of demands as to what I should report, and made demands that I report, post a video that they had put out, which I was not going to do. And then they ended with, there will be repercussions. We're always watching, we're always waiting, that type thing. That was the first time I really realized how extensive this network is of anti-fascist researchers. Because when that was posted, I heard from the Southern Poverty Law Center, I heard from the ADL, the FBI contacted local police to alert them. I heard from other anti-fascist researchers saying, okay, you need to take this seriously. This is a real concern. At the time, we did not know who was behind that account. And so it was really an eye-opening experience to have this many groups and this many researchers reaching out to me saying, be careful.
One of the folks behind that account ended up being Liam Nix, who
Correct.
was at the time an active duty soldier stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which is a tremendous military base. Appalachian Archives, I believe I was their very first target. I think that the very first post that they made on their Telegram channel was targeting me and telling me that I was, and telling journalists that I was just the first. Other people that they went after, other journalists, include Jordan Green from Raw Story, who the Tennessee Active Club with Liam Nix showed up at his house, burnt a road flare, and held a sign that said something like freedom of speech does not, or freedom of journalism does not mean freedom from consequences, which law enforcement
Correct.
apparently witnessed and just let happen and didn't interpret that as a threat. Do you think that I know that you said FBI called local law enforcement, but do you think that local law enforcement, not just by you, but everywhere, understand threats like this when they are reported? Not just by journalists, but by any American. What you experienced, I think, fits the textbook or the legal definition of terrorism, which is to use violence or threat of violence to coerce either a government or a civilian populace into complying with something along with political lines. They were trying to use threats against you to force you to promote their propaganda. That, I think, that fits the federal definition of terrorism. Do you think that local law enforcement understands these things at all? Do you think that, and not just the beat cops, but the local district's attorneys, are they taking these things seriously enough?
I think there's a problem. Number one, no, I don't think they're taking it seriously enough. There was an incident that Jordan Green, as I recall, had reported on, where members of the Tennessee Active Club had gone to a drag show in a town about an hour and a half east of Nashville, had thrown what they called a stink bomb, I think, and they were stopped by local police, and basically the local police said, okay, we don't want to go through the hassle of making an arrest. So, just stay, head out of town and stay away. The problem is, and I would be interested in your perspective on this, what I'm told is a lot of these groups are very careful. They walk right up to the line of making implied threats, but they leave themselves just enough wiggle room where they can say, oh, no, we were not meaning physical violence. We were meaning that we were going to expose them for who they are, that type thing. And so my experience, and in fact, I just had an encounter online with someone who came into a Facebook messaging and told me that I would soon be kneeling at someone's feet and begging for forgiveness, that I needed to be silenced. And when I replied, what do you mean? He quickly said, well, I mean you no harm. And so they're very smart about trying to figure out how to stay just right on this side of that line. And so from what I've been told, that's the difficulty that law enforcement has in making a case. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that the problem is district's attorneys are afraid of juries not understanding. In my interactions with local district's attorneys, with FBI agents, with local law enforcement, and with those in North Carolina, where my mother received a personally delivered death threat, is that when they see these types of things, if there's even a remote amount of plausible deniability, as you just explained, that a jury wouldn't convict. After my mother was threatened by a neo-Nazi in North Carolina, who hand-delivered a book called The White Dolphin. It's a youth novel about a mother who's murdered over her political activism. It had on its cover a picture of Hitler, and it said Mein Kampf is available online. On the back, it had a sticker from Will to Rise, which is a Patriot Front active club affiliated business run by Robert Rundo, one of the most infamous neo-Nazis, not just in our country, but globally. And the local law enforcement, when they first received that, they interpreted it as a prank. I had to fly down to North Carolina to speak with a magistrate and have lawyers. Thankfully, I had lawyers who were handling this case pro bono, but lawyers had to fly from Chicago to help prosecute this case because the local district attorney, the local magistrate, the local law enforcement didn't understand the severity of what just happened. In fact, the sheriff's deputies who showed up at my mother's house and received this evidence of a death threat offered to throw it out on their way back to the office, on the way back to the station, because they didn't recognize that a crime had occurred at all.
Throw out evidence.
Yeah, they offered to throw it in a dumpster. They said, there's a dumpster that I can throw this in on the way back to the station. Do you want me to do that? And thankfully, my mother had the presence of mind, as distressed as she was, that she called me in that moment and asked me what to do. And I made sure that everything was preserved. And eventually the FBI came and picked it up. But it took me a year and a half to see that case prosecuted. And I'm a professional researcher, and I had the benefit of this guy bragging about what he had done online. So I had an open admission. The intent was clearly stated, and it still took a hell of a lot of convincing to get the local prosecutor to move forward, and eventually he was convicted by of a hate crime. It was the first time, I believe, that specific statute had actually been charged and prosecuted and resulted in a guilty verdict, and it passed during the civil rights era. It was just sitting there on the books, and no one in North Carolina was using it. So I think that part of the problem is that law enforcement, district's attorneys, the FBI, they don't have a lot of faith in Americans to find a neo-Nazi guilty of making what an objective person would define as a threat. I think law enforcement has lost faith to a certain extent in the ability of Americans to understand this, because once I got through to the district's attorney and to the law enforcement, help contextualize what had happened, they seem to genuinely care, but they seem to be really wary of the idea of convincing a jury to care. I think that was the biggest hang up. But after the guilty verdict, I got the opportunity, and everyone in the jury wanted to speak with me after the fact. Everyone hung on every word during the trial. And I wish that there were cameras in the room. But in rural North Carolina, that was just not an option. We asked the judge if we could record, and we were not able to. So this successful prosecution of a hate crime, as far as we can tell, the first in North Carolina, there is a record of, but only if someone's willing to go and read court transcripts.
And I think your example is a good one, because the reaction from my viewers to my standing up to these hate groups, these extremist groups, has been tremendous. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do I get pushback from MAGA types online? Absolutely. But, when I'm out at the grocery store, when I'm out at a restaurant, it is very, very common for people to come up to me and say, thank you. Thank you for standing up. And so I think we just need to learn to trust our juries more.
Mm-hmm. Is that what keeps you going? I mean, there are so many journalists who I have seen who have touched on these issues, who've done one article about an extremist organization, they receive threats, and then they clam up. Is it the public response that keeps you going? What is it that stopped you from throwing up your hands and walking away from this beat, and instead you embraced it and have only doubled down on making sure that people who watch your station understand the threat that exists in their local neighborhoods?
The public response truly helps, but I'm afraid of walking away. And what I mean by that is when these sorts of extremists, threaten and attempt to intimidate me, their goal is to drive me from the playing field. their goal is to drive me from the democratic process. And if we allow that to happen, then our country is in serious trouble. And so I don't feel like I have the luxury of walking away because there is so much at stake. Letting them force me to walk away, it just doesn't work for me, and I don't think it leads to the kind of country that we want to leave for our children.
Do you feel safe right now?
I do. I have lots of reasons that I will not discuss to feel safe. But I don't take foolish risks. For example, I confronted a group of neo-Nazis, the Goyim Defense League, in July of 24, and kind of went head to head with them.
You ready to debunk the flyers? I told you I'd stop being a Nazi. What's your thoughts about you lying in the media?
Yeah, I'm curious. Why Nashville? Why did you guys choose Nashville?
The only place that respects freedom of speech.
Yeah, this state actually respects freedom of speech, but communist Jews like yourself.
Can I be honest with you guys?
You're a loser, scumbag.
When I look at you guys, I do not think that's your
You
race.
look like what race are you?
Time is coming to its end.
In fact, what I saw was a group of wounded, angry men who've never accomplished much in their own lives, looking for someone else to blame.
Worse than the Jews.
I really feel sorry for you guys.
I don't give a sorry for it. You're gonna grave soon, you dumb sellout boomer.
You boomer.
What you don't really see on camera is I chose the place that confrontation would occur. And I chose to do it when there were 20, 30, 40 cops standing behind me. And so, I take reasonable precautions. And here's the other thing. I think deep down these groups don't, if they're smart, they're not going to try to do anything to me and my family because they're going to bring down law enforcement on their heads, and that denies them their platform. So I think they would be foolish to do anything. So I don't take unreasonable risks, but I do think what I'm doing is working.
I think that I'm experiencing kind of the same type of thing. I decided a long time ago when I first started infiltrating extremist groups that I would do it under my real name, that I would do it publicly. My first infiltration into Patriot Front, I live tweeted them responding to the article that was written about my infiltration, because I was still inside of their Rocket Chat servers, which was very comical for me, very cathartic after months and months and months of having to watch them self-radicalize and plan. I think that more folks should understand that there is a benefit of being so publicly confrontational, and you're not doing it as an activist. You're doing it as a journalist, as someone whose loyalty is to the democratic process. To your desire is to get the truth out there, and you have found that that being so public has created a veil of protection around you. Do you think that your example is something that other local journalists can benefit from?
Absolutely. And let's go back to Franklin, Tennessee, the situation there. Appalachian Archives was doxing other members of the community. And I kept expecting them to dox me and they did not. The only thing I can attribute that to is the fact that I was so public, and they knew that would draw lots and lots of attention to them. And so I think the more public we can be about our processes, but also I've chosen to be very public about the threats and the intimidation. There's only a couple of things that I can say that I've not written about, and I will write about those in due time. But the more public we can be, and the more we can shine the light not only on their activities, but what they're trying to do to us as journalists, as researchers, I think makes us safer.
Do you think that the threats are escalating right now? Or what you've experienced over the last few years, do you think that that is becoming more common? Or do you think that the kind of like the neo-Nazi far right has kind of reached its capacity to cause harm?
I think the danger is because of everything that's happened politically in our country over the last 10 years. Ordinary people feel a little more comfortable making those sorts of veiled threats. I've had several veiled threats on my Facebook page in the last few weeks. When I push back, then the people say, well, I really didn't mean that as a threat. But yeah, sure, that they meant it as a threat and only backed down when they were called out on it. So I think that's the problem, is that ordinary people who are not, in these organized groups feel it's okay for them to make implied threats.
Now, for Kyliam Nix, who went under Appalachian Archives and then American Archives after some of his Telegram channels started getting removed, he was eventually identified by some anonymous anti-fascists who were working with the SPLC and Jeff Tischauer, who's one of the preeminent experts on Patriot Front and their affiliated fascist street gangs. Can you tell us what's going on with Nix after he was identified? When the SPLC came out with his identity, it was in conjunction with a piece, a very lengthy magazine piece, and I believe the New Yorker. It seems to me like things just kind of went quiet. He got kicked out of the Army, we know that. But what else is going on with this case after he, doxed multiple journalists? He issued what I define as terroristic threats against you. Has he been held accountable for any of that?
That's a real mystery, because if you look at the court record, he pleaded guilty to a single charge, as I recall, but that plea is under seal. And he has been scheduled for sentencing several times. He was scheduled most recently to be sentenced in the month of February, and I checked yesterday, and that's been put off till April. Now, what's going on with the case? It would only be speculation on my part, but one of the questions I have is it possible that he's a cooperating witness now? And is he working against the Patriot Front or any of these other allied groups? That's pure speculation, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask under the circumstances.
Yeah, it's frustrating to me. I do think that you are right, that the only reasonable conclusion is that he must be now a traitor to Patriot Front, turning in his old buddies, who he dedicated basically his entire life to. That seems to be the only rational thing that I can make sense of it. What he was initially charged with was not things related to doxing or terroristic threats. It was international and interstate weapons charges. He was buying and or selling ghost gun parts, essentially, right. Which is a serious and tremendous crime. But I feel personally that I've been denied justice because he was never charged with posting my home address online or posting pictures of my wife and family with terroristic threats. Do you think that that law enforcement is kind of taking the easy way out and only going with the weapons charges when there is so much evidence of clear violations of federal law across the board on other issues?
It's really hard to speculate on that. I was surprised, like you, that when they did indict him, that it was only on really unrelated weapons charges. So I'm willing to wait and give them the benefit of the doubt. I think when he is finally sentenced, we'll find out if they're taking the easy way out or if maybe they were doing something a little more in depth. Now, that process began under the previous administration, as I recall. So we'll see whether the current FBI is going forward with anything that he might bring them. Again, speculation on my part, but I think, as you say, it's reasonable speculation.
So part of the reason that I think your reporting is so great on this is because you're taking it from a local angle. You're not projecting across the United States. That's not your primary audience, but you're telling people what their neighbors are up to and the dangers that they face and their children face in their communities, their churches, their mosques face in their own communities. What is it that national journalists are getting wrong about this? My view on this is that you've educated your viewers to the threat really well, but national journalists have not been able to do the same thing for the United States as a whole. Is there something that national journalists are getting wrong? Is there some way that the lack of the local connection is preventing them from being able to help Americans understand this threat that we all live with?
The reason that I call my Substack publication Hate Comes to Main Street is I came to realize over the last couple of years that this sort of hate had been festering at the local level, that it had just grown without anyone noticing, that it was developing at the local level, and it was expanding across the country. What I found was, we tend to view white supremacy as one thing. Well, then, my investigation led into Christian nationalism and QAnon conspiracy theories. And in the process of doing this work over the last couple of years, I realized that they were no longer distinct things, that they were no longer just a part of a Venn diagram where there was some overlap, that white supremacy, Christian nationalism, QAnon conspiracy theories has sort of fed upon each other until they had almost become indistinguishable. And once you have these crazy beliefs that are feeding on each other at the local level, once it's happening on Main Street, it was only a matter of time before it made its way to Pennsylvania Avenue. So the fact that we're seeing people being nominated for Senate confirmed positions who have very strong white supremacist, anti-Semitic views is best understood by looking at the fact that this has been growing on Main Street across the country for years, and we've just never noticed. I think journalists make a mistake by saying we're not going to give oxygen to these crazies. Well, the fact is, it's like a brush fire. It's already got oxygen. It's only when it is ignored and unattended that it becomes a flaming wildfire. And so I think that's the mistake that we have made as journalists, local, national, is ignoring the brush fire that had been burning in our communities.
So one of the experiences that you have had that I have not is talking to white supremacists as a journalist. I have only talked to white supremacists as one of them undercover, or projecting, my voice online, in which we're not really interacting unless I'm trying to get information, or if I'm making fun of them. When you've talked to these white supremacists, when you've interviewed them, have they told you, and do you think they're being honest if they have, what drew them into these movements?
I've not had those kind of heart-to-heart interviews. My interviews have been more confrontational. And so what I do going into these interviews is I try to prepare and show them for who they really are. And so, confronting members of the Goyim Defense League, for example, they, one of their big things is they're, out against pedophiles. Well, I was able to confront them with the fact that one of their own was a pedophile, had been convicted of trying to have sex with a 14-year-old girl.
I have a photo of you with a pedophile right there.
Oh, yeah, you got kicked out of our group.
That's Menodeo on the left, and on the right, a member of his group, Jesse Schenck, who was busted 3 years ago when he tried to meet up with someone he thought was a 14-year-old girl for sex.
That, they claimed all aspects of the Biden administration were Jewish. Well, there's a long list of cabinet members who are clearly not Jewish. And so what I try to do in these interviews is to, shine the light and to confront them with the fallacies that are the foundation of their hate. And so, there's actually one person that I am trying to talk to, would like to talk to try to understand how he got there, but those are not the type of interviews that I've been able to have so far.
Now that you've become a known figure among the neo-Nazis, you are seen as hostile press, as the opposition, as a threat. How is it that they respond to you? Do you see them kind of retreat a bit, as confident as they may try to project their voice? Do you see them as afraid of you?
That, I think, is another reflection of our times. No, they're not afraid. I was staking out the arrival of guests at the American Renaissance Conference, which is a white nationalist conference that's held every year just out at a state park, at a state park just outside of Nashville. Thomas Rousseau, the head of Patriot Front, drives through and he actually calls out, "Howdy, Phil." So, there's no, sense of being fearful. It's, I'm known by white supremacists now. Eric Orwell, of Return to the Land, who wants to start these whites-only communities, actually stopped and talked to me at that checkpoint. So and again, I think it's a reflection of our political times. And Eric Orwell says he thinks that, now is the time for him to push his whites-only communities because he thinks he'll get a sympathetic ear from the Trump administration. So no, they're not fearful right now. I think they're still emboldened.
So Christopher Mathias, author of To Catch a Fascist, who I know you're going to be interviewing soon after we're recording this, and who I just interviewed a few days ago, he writes in his book that the goal of fascists who wear masks is to create a world in which they don't have to wear masks anymore. Do you think that these groups that you and I have been studying for a few years now, do you think they've accomplished that goal? Or do you think that there is still further for them to push? Do you still see them moving the Overton window, hiding their identities, or do you think they're all ready to come out and fully embrace their beliefs publicly with their own names attached? I ask because we saw this week, as we're recording this, Senator Chris Murphy was interrogating someone who's up for a nomination at the State Department who believes that there is a white genocide happening, who believes that there is a cultural genocide against white people happening in this country. And the man wasn't a shrinking violet while he was testifying. He could not intelligently respond to the questions, though he did try. It appeared that he was trying his best to put words behind his thoughts, but he didn't back down. He fully embraced the idea of white genocide in front of a nationally televised Senate hearing. Do you think the minions behind Tommy Rousseau of Patriot Front are ready to rip off their masks, or do you think they're going to keep acting with a little bit of self-preservation?
Yeah, I don't see Patriot Front ripping off the masks because, I think the estimates vary, that maybe they have 300 active members. I don't know if you agree with that number. I think if the masks were taken off, they'd have a lot fewer active members. But there is a vanguard that, like Jeremy Carl, that are, out there, and I think you bring up an interesting, point when you reference the Overton window, because if you, as we study these groups, they talk a lot about the Overton window, moving the window of what is considered politically acceptable to talk about. And so, for example, I think we've seen that with the immigration issue. They have managed to focus all of the attention on crimes that are committed by immigrants. And there's almost no conversation about the benefits of immigration. There is almost no conversation about the immigrants who have been heroes, who have made such a difference in American society. And so I think they have successfully moved the Overton window to the point that it's okay to disparage immigrants and to completely ignore any positive contributions of immigration. And so it is a battle for the Overton window. And the more successful that they are with shifting the Overton window to the right, the more they're going to be willing to come out and be open and to show themselves for who they are.
Do you think that the sunlight that you have shown through your reporting has resulted in any victims getting justice, or do you think that that a lot of your efforts have gone without perhaps the response that you expected?
I think it's a slow process. I think there were people who, like myself, did not fully appreciate what's going on out there in this subculture. And so I think I have opened eyes. So back in the fall, did a series of stories about how the Goyim Defense League is going into video chat rooms where children hang out, disparaging children of color, disparaging immigrants, but also trying to recruit white kids to get them to follow GDL websites, to get especially young boys to get guns and to get ready to kill N-words. And so I think there's been a real awakening from that story, for example. I can say that definitely made a difference because I heard from parents saying, I had no idea this was going on. It's not a sprint, as they say, it's a marathon. And that's really why I've started this Hate Comes to Main Street, because I think it gives me the ability to continue with that marathon, hopefully for the long haul.
So, Phil, one of the questions that I always ask all of my guests is, what is it that people can do to go on offense against the forces of hate, against fascism, in their communities or nationally. So what is your advice to our listeners, the average American who is not an expert in any of these things? What can they do to go on offense against these folks?
Well, in this day of social media, everyone has a voice. And in certain forums, most of the voices I hear are the voices of hate. I think in those situations, the normies, the people who believe in democracy, have a chance to stand up and to defend, those of us who are more on the front lines, to amplify the messages that we're putting out there. So, I think, the best thing people can do is be aware, and then amplify the voices that are calling this out. That's what ordinary people can do.
Phil Williams, thank you so much for being guest on Offense. Please tell our listeners how they can follow your work, how they can support your work.
Yeah, hatecomestamainstreet.com is the new publication website. I am on Blue Sky at philinvestigates.com. And you can find me on all of the platforms. But Hate Comes to Main Street is my focus for the larger audience right now.
Thanks so much, Phil. When Phil talks about hate coming to Main Street, he's not speaking metaphorically. He's talking about city council meetings, school board races, local sheriff elections, county party fundraisers. He's talking about the places where we raise our families and assume politics is boring. That's the lesson here. What happened to me wasn't some fringe internet drama. It wasn't anonymous trolls shit posting to own the libs. It was an ecosystem of violent extremism lashing out against an existential threat. That ecosystem, a doxing channel, provides target information for international terrorist organizations. The ecosystem connects national white supremacist organizations with local street gangs. And those within it escalate from online threats to showing up outside a journalist's house in a matter of months. It's an ecosystem where extremist activists embed themselves in a mayoral campaign. That's Main Street. And the reason this matters is because most people still think extremism lives somewhere else, in the woods, in another state, in a compound in the middle of nowhere, in a dark corner of the internet. But it doesn't. It shows up at school board meetings in wealthy white suburbs. It shows up in a sheriff's race in major metro areas. It shows up as security at a candidate's campaign event. After decades of investigative reporting, Phil Williams discovered things that he can't look away from. How extremist organizations embed themselves locally to achieve power. How they build relationships with people considered mainstream enough to run for office. How they normalize their presence in the political theater. And how they use threats and intimidation to silence truth tellers. And here's what makes local journalism so dangerous to them. Local journalists know the terrain. They know the players. They know when something doesn't add up. It makes it harder for these assholes to remain anonymous, to separate their extremist activity and associations from the rest of their lives. And even if the federal government rarely prosecutes things like online threats, doxing, or swatting of journalists and researchers, local communities can impose their own legal, social, and economic costs on bad actors in their own neighborhood. You can't intimidate someone who understands the ecosystem you're trying to build. That's why Phil was targeted. That's why Jordan Green was targeted. And that's why I was targeted. Because hate doesn't want sunlight on Main Street. In the dark, it can grow stronger and dig into our local institutions where it can start promoting its ideology and subverting our democracy. The antidote to this is to not panic. It's to pay attention. Pay attention to your local politics. Support the reporters in your hometown who are asking hard questions. Show up when extremists try to normalize themselves in civic spaces. No one is coming to save your town, but you can fight to protect it. Subscribe to Phil Williams' Hate Comes to Main Street. Support investigative journalism where you live and wherever else you can. And if you value the kind of research and accountability work that I do, subscribe to On Offense at weareonoffense.com. And please consider becoming a paid supporter. This work is intentional, and it takes a team. On Offense is produced by Gina Kim and edited by Victoria Lombardo for the Valor Media Network. Please make sure you're subscribed on Substack, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Rate the show wherever you can and encourage your friends to do the same. Because hate doesn't stay on the margins. It comes to Main Street. And there, you can fight it and win. Now let's go on offense.